New Zealand is shutting down again. What do you make of it? Some news organizations report these cases as magical. Is it a failure? Wasn't the whole point getting rid of the coronavirus? Using strict quarantine measures like not allowing any restaurants, even McDonald's, to remain open, not allowing people to interact with their neighbors, not even allowing their neighbors to toss a ball back that went into their yard? Today we'll discuss what failure or success with the coronavirus means, how these new cases could have happened, and what changes can be made going forward. One way of determining how well a country is doing is by measuring its life expectancy. We've all heard these comparisons, and it does make sense because usually countries that are rich have people that live longer. In rich countries, the safety standards are higher, meaning that people don't usually die by escalator incidents. In the US, the building codes are much tougher. In China, well. So if you take that same logic and discuss the coronavirus, one way of looking at success or failure is by number of deaths. If you look at deaths by the coronavirus, you'll see that New Zealand is very low on the list. 22 total deaths. And the US is at the top. Some may say that's unfair though, as the population in the US is much more, and that's correct. So let's look at it divided out by the total number of people. Per 1 million people, how many died? Well, New Zealand is 4. The US is still highest at 516. That means your chances of dying of coronavirus in the US are more than 100 times that of New Zealand. It's much safer in New Zealand than it is the US. You're likely to live longer if you're elderly, if you're at high risk of dying if you contract the coronavirus. Meaning that years down the road, the longevity of people living in the US is probably going to be lower, and New Zealand's probably going to be higher by comparison. Some may say, though, the New Zealand plan wasn't successful, but they had to shut down again. My response is, so? A future response, a requirement to adapt your plans, doesn't mean you're not successful. Look at this photo post-tornado. Wouldn't you say the people on the left whose houses are intact did a wonderful job fighting the tornado? Of course not. It has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with the tornado. The coronavirus is a natural disaster. It's not a tornado, though, where you may prepare your house and it could still get destroyed. There's not much you can do to prepare against a tornado, just escape. The coronavirus is more like a hurricane. It hits all the houses, and your preparation may hold or it may not, depending on the strength of the hurricane. We don't actually have any means to fight the coronavirus. We don't have a treatment that cures it. We don't have a vaccine. So I'd say preventing deaths without an effective antiviral is pretty successful, which New Zealand has managed to do. But let's talk about how this could have happened. How did they have more cases pop up? First, is it the people coming back? Let's look at what they do when you arrive in New Zealand. Manage isolation, and then return a negative coronavirus test. But just like any policy or procedure, we have to see if there's any way that people or coronavirus cases can slip through the cracks. So they isolate everybody for 14 days, which is standard. They don't mention return a negative test, which just means they may not actually test everybody. And they also have exemptions for serious medical conditions, which may mean these people may slip through the cracks, because just because you have a serious medical condition doesn't mean you can't be bringing in the coronavirus. Let's also take a moment to review the concept of a false negative, meaning the test says you are negative, as in you don't have the coronavirus, and yet you actually do. We all know tests can be wrong. There's nothing that's 100%. And let me explain how we actually quantify this. We have two types of errors called type 1 and type 2. Simple enough, right? The idea is that the test result sometimes doesn't match up with reality. On the top, you have the test result answer, positive or negative. On the left, you have the true result, which is what's actually going on in the person's body. We all know there are many ways a test can be wrong. Maybe they just didn't catch it. Like when they sample a tumor for cancer, sometimes you miss it. Like with prostate, that's particularly well known. It's there, but you didn't catch it in that little needle you stuck in. But when the test result matches the true condition, they show it as green here. Good. True. True positive, meaning the test is positive, the person actually has it. And true negative, meaning the test is negative and the person does not have it. Then we encounter our two types of errors where the test is wrong. Like when you put in an order at the drive-thru and they give you the wrong thing. A mistake. Well, we know it happens. Type 1 error is a false positive, meaning it's not actually there when the test is saying it's there. like a person who's been wrongly imprisoned for a crime they didn't commit. It happens, unfortunately. And type 2 is a false negative, meaning a murderer is walking out free because they weren't caught. This is the one we want to know regarding New Zealand's testing, or coronavirus testing in general. Usually you have to choose to err on one side or the other. In coronavirus testing cases, we want to err on the side more false positive, less on the false negative side. Because you may have people who think they are free of the virus, who aren't, and they go on and spread it even more because they don't think they have it. And this is actually Taiwanese logic for why they make everybody quarantine. They don't do testing at the airport when people arrive. The false negative rate, or type 2 error, is just 1 minus the sensitivity. The sensitivity is a percentage. Say it's 90%. So take 90 divided by 100 to get 0.9. 1 minus 0.9 is 0.1. Convert to percentage, 10%. So the higher sensitivity, the lower the false negative rate is. So we want a very sensitive test. For those who say it's more complicated, that's a little bit true. They say you should take into account prevalence, that is how much viral load there is in the population. And because New Zealand has a lower prevalence, actually number of false negatives should be lower. But that's not actually correct. The logic is correct that you need to take into account prevalence to calculate actual number, not just the rate. But you can't actually take into account New Zealand's prevalence because people coming in aren't coming from New Zealand. That's the whole point. They're coming from other countries where the prevalence is a lot higher. We also know no test is 100%, as I said before. The sensitivity of PCR test, the gold standard, the best we got, varies. They mention here depends on the site where you get it. So it's best when you get a bronchoalveolar lavage, which is you stick a tube into the lung and gets the samples. Obviously, that's not usually done. And it also depends on how long it is since you've been exposed. It's just interesting to look at this curve because right after exposure, your chance is very low that you'll test positive the day after you've been exposed, even if you end up getting it. The test gets better and better until about day 8, and then it gets worse again. Do you know even people who have been exposed a long time may not test positive, which is contrary to what popular opinion has been. You think, oh, you've been exposed a while ago. Oh, if you haven't tested positive, you're not going to test positive. But this graph is actually telling us it's not true. So what may happen is you get exposed, fly to New Zealand, quarantine for 14 days, and you're still testing negative because you got exposed a week before you went to New Zealand. So the 14 days now makes you at 21 days. And if you look at the percent probability that you test negative, even though you actually have it at 21 days, it's actually worse than 50%. It's worse than a coin flip. It's been a few months since New Zealand opened up. 102 coronavirus-free days. That's wonderful. 3 months and counting. It was good times, but unfortunately it ended and now they're going back into lockdown. So what's the strategy going forward? What can we change to try to prevent this from happening? Well, unfortunately, it seems like more cases are going to just pop up. We don't know everything about a coronavirus. We could still use the quarantine strategy to beat it down, but we're not sure exactly how it works. We don't know all the details yet. But I think one big thing is we should change the testing strategy. Remember when Maria van Kerkhove said that asymptomatic transmission of coronavirus is rare? Now we know that's absolutely false. We should revamp testing though because we know that's not true. Just because someone doesn't have symptoms, has a negative test, doesn't mean they don't have it. We shouldn't be less suspicious of them just because they don't have symptoms. If someone's coughing up a storm and getting a test, oh, we're going to test you again. We don't believe that. But if they're asymptomatic, we shouldn't necessarily believe that either. One negative test may not be enough. Doing additional tests can increase your sensitivity. Let me talk about the example of TB testing to see when you could remove a person from isolation because they're no longer infectious. This is something done very well here in the US. TB is not a big deal here at all. There's a wonderful test for TB called a culture where the lab grows it. Unfortunately, it will literally be weeks before you get any results back because that's how long it takes them to grow TB. So we can't really use that test because it just takes too long. You don't want to just keep a person in a hospital for weeks on end. So instead we use something called an AFB smear, where somebody does a stain on the organisms to see if you find something that lights up here. You see these red or purple lines? That's TB. It's not the best test, we miss it a lot, but that's okay because we have some tricks up our sleeves to improve it. We use 3 tests first of all, not collected all at once, but spaced out at separate intervals. In case TB is currently taking a nap, we could come back later and ring its doorbell, just like when the UPS man has missed you and they check back later. Even though apparently that's not always true nowadays, they may not check back later. One test is done early in the morning because they know, oh, TB is more likely to be present in the sputum early in the morning. Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we don't actually know when you're more likely to test positive. Is it in the morning, evening? There actually may be some relevance, or is it after you eat spicy food? We don't know those details about the coronavirus, but we can do multiple tests. Maybe instead of doing one test the last day before we let them go free, we do one test every single of their last day. So we do 3 tests every day in a row for the last 3 days. We've known for a long time that tests aren't actually great. Way back when we didn't know much about this, when Dr. Li Wenliang was, a whistleblower in China still alive, he actually tested multiple times negative. But they kept on testing and finally it was positive. I mean, they knew he had it, right? But why did he keep testing negative? He died from it. Obviously, he had it pretty serious. It's not an issue improving the test though. The lab can't do much. The issue is the coronavirus just isn't present in the sample you collected. What is the lab going to do about that? So we have to improve our bad testing, and one way is doing multiple tests. If the second time's not the charm, maybe the third is. And lastly, we know this pandemic is not going away anytime soon. We just have to keep working on it. Keeping everybody safe is not a one-time deal. Just because we had a good time driving yesterday without our seatbelt on doesn't mean we shouldn't wear our seatbelt today, because we may get into an accident today. Things change. Danger is present. Things may happen. The coronavirus is still out there. There's actually another explanation for the New Zealand coronavirus resurgence. I hope it's not true. Don't really want to talk about it, but one question is, can this virus actually stay in the body long term like chickenpox? It could reactivate sometime later. That would explain why New Zealand's gone so long, because there's some people just hiding out. It's a very unpleasant thought. Hopefully it's not correct, because that means the virus is here for decades.